A Union Like Ours, the love story of F.O. Matthiessen and Russell Cheney. My thesis is that Matthiessen and Cheney, who spent a lot of time in Santa Fe, New Mexico, were in essence married in everything but name and legal rights. I've been working on this project in one form or another since reading a book review of The Crimson Letter, a book about gay men at Harvard in the spring of 2003 in the New York Times. The review references Matthiessen and Cheney, as well as Mathiessen's most influential book, American Renaissance Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman. I went and checked out Mathiessen's book, First Chance I Got. And in the beginning, in the author's note, it's place stamped Kittery, Maine. I had grown up in the area, so that detail hooked me. I started to read everything I could about Matthiessen, Cheney, and their relationship. And I saw their story as a shared of their shared lives together as a love story. One note about the book before we begin. It has a brief autobiographical frame around Matthiessen and Cheney's story. It did not start out that way. It started out as a straightforward double biography of Matthiessen and Cheney's story on its own. But at one point, I was fortunate enough to work with the great writing teacher, Bill Zinzer. And Bill said to me, "Why have you written this book? You're not an art historian or a literary critic. What is it about this story that has appealed to you and that has captured your imagination? This is what you need to share with people." I resisted this, but relented to the point that I was at least willing to give it a try. And it did solve one important problem of not wanting to end the story on Mathiessen's suicide by itself. Because strange as it may sound, as heartbreaking as Mathiessen's death by suicide on April 1st, 1950, at the age of 48 was, I don't read his and Cheney's story as a complete downer. There are sad parts of the story, to be sure, but watching and listening to these two men figure out their relationship in which they had no living role models was profoundly moving to me. Matthiessen was one of the preeminent scholars of his generation, the early to mid 20th century. Again, he wrote American Renaissance and he helped found the field of American studies. Cheney was a moderately successful minor painter. During the 1920s, he was the hot, not quite so young thing in the art world. F.O. Matthiessen was born in 1902 in Pasadena, California. He was 20 years Cheney's junior. He grew up in LaSalle, Illinois, with his mother and paternal grandparents. He was very close to his mother, Lucy Orne Pratt, who had grown up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and was a distant relative of Sarah Orne Jewett. She met Frederick William Matthiessen Jr. at a resort in California. F.W. Matthiessen Jr. was a playboy, and Matthiessen disliked him for much of his life, although they were reconciled late in life. Matthiessen wrote in a letter to Cheney early on in their relationship that there was, quote, an empty space where my father should have been. Matthiessen was much closer to his paternal grandfather, founder of the Western Clocks Company, or Clock Company, later known as West Clocks, and maker of Big Ben alarm clocks. Matthiessen graduated from Yale in 1923. He came to life intellectually at Yale, certainly his interest in literature, but also his interest in progressive politics and organized labor. Matthiessen was elected into the prestigious senior society, Skull and Bones, where he picked up the nickname Devil. He won a Rhodes Scholarship and spent 2 years at New College at Oxford. Russell Cheney typified everything that Matthiessen valued. He was a darkly handsome gay man. He was stereotypical Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, but most importantly, he was a working artist. Born in 1881 in South Manchester, Connecticut, Russell Cheney was the youngest of 11 children of a very large extended family of silk manufacturers. Cheney Brothers was a phenomenally successful business. Between the Civil War and World War II, Cheney Brothers was one of the largest silk manufacturers in the country and was instrumental in introducing machine woven silk to the industry. The slide pictured here shows the 36-acre campus of Cheney Brothers in South Manchester, Connecticut. Russell Cheney also graduated from Yale in 1904. Cheney was very popular in college, but also known for being quite quiet. He too was elected into Skull and Bones, where he picked up the nickname Rat. Matthiessen and Cheney met in 1924 aboard the ocean liner Paris. Matthiessen was bound for Oxford for the second year of his Rhodes Scholarship. He was 22. Cheney was bound for Venice to paint. He was 42. And this selection I'm about to read is from the early chapter in the book entitled Falling in Love. On the fourth day of the voyage, Matthiessen decided to speak more candidly about sex. Presumably, Matthiessen felt a spark of attraction to Cheney, and their shared Skull and Bones membership made it easier to reveal such confidences. Matthiessen brought up Havelock Ellis, whose writing on homosexuality he had read the previous spring, but then he backed away. Later, after an evening of stargazing on deck, Matthiessen brought Cheney into his cabin to give him a good night snack of a pear. Then he summoned all his courage and jumped in. I know it won't make any difference to our friendship, but there's one thing I've got to tell you, he said by way of awkward preface. Referring to his days at the Hackley School, Matthiessen declared, I was sexually inverted. Of course, I've controlled it since. Matthiessen described the miraculous moment that followed. The munching of the pear died away. There was perhaps a half minute of the most heavily freighted silence I've ever felt. Then, in a faraway voice I never heard, came the answer, my God, feller, you've turned me upside down. I'm that way too. Matthiessen and Cheney sat for several minutes in stunned silence. They were no longer alone. Each man had found another, someone whom he viewed as an equal and a peer. Until then, both Matthiessen and Cheney had largely cordoned off their lives with friendships on one side and chance clandestine sexual encounters on the other side. But that night, aboard the Paris, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a different world in which love and sex could come together suddenly blossomed. This moment of emotional communion, however, did not lead to sex. Instead, Matthiessen and Cheney stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning, talking about their respective sexual histories and experiences as each man had done as part of his induction into Skull and Bones. When Cheney said goodnight before returning to his own cabin, he affectionately tousled Mathiessen's hair and thanked him for his courage in speaking so candidly. The remainder of the voyage passed quickly as Cheney and Matthiessen talked and talked. On the last night, they rested on a couch in Cheney's cabin with Cheney's head in Mathiessen's lap. Later, they changed positions with both men simply lying next to each other, fully dressed. Their shoulders and knees occasionally touched, words ebbed as each man savored the presence of the other. And then Cheney turned and kissed Matthiessen squarely on the lips, and Matthiessen ran his fingers through Cheney's wondrously thick hair. In a more contemporary era, this might have been prelude to sex, but not for Matthiessen and Cheney. As Matthiessen later wrote about the experience, that was all. The next morning, we shook hands. I got off the boat at Plymouth. I knew I had a new, unbelievably rich friendship. He and Cheney made plans to meet in Italy over Mathiessen's Christmas holiday and pledged to write often. And write they did. Part of what makes Matthiessen and Cheney's story so appealing to research and write about is how incredibly well documented it is. During their lifetimes, they exchanged roughly 3,100 letters with each other. The letters are very intimate and open. They told one another just about everything. So coming to the Southwest, By way of background, in 1916, when Cheney was 35 years old, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He had already lost 3 siblings to the disease. Cheney came to Colorado Springs to be treated at Cragmore Sanatorium, which was known as the Sun Palace. The dry climate of Colorado Springs and the Southwest generally were thought to be conducive to recovery. In the days before antibiotics, treatment for tuberculosis consisted primarily of rest, plenty of outdoor air, and a healthy diet. Cheney was plagued by breathing problems throughout his life. But during his time in Colorado Springs, in 1917, he started to visit his cousin, Louisa Cheney Pugh, in Santa Fe. And in 1929, after a recurrence of tuberculosis, Cheney's doctors once again shipped him off to Cragmore. But this time, after he recovered, rather than return home to the east right away, he came to Santa Fe. This second trip, Cheney established himself in Santa Fe, and he quickly became part of a wealthy and artistic circle that included Bronson Cutting, Republican U.S. Senator and owner of the influential newspaper, the Santa Fe New Mexican. Cheney's circle also included the poet Whitter Binner, painter Andrew Michael Dasburg, and Clifford McCarthy, who became Bronson Cutting's companion and secretary. Cheney completed a painting in 1930 entitled 3 Friends, also known as 343 Buena Vista Road, which depicts Louisa Pugh, Whitter Binner, and Clifford McCarthy sitting around a small circular table having tea. Cheney always responded strongly to his environment, and this was especially true in Santa Fe. He completed numerous paintings in Santa Fe of the area and its environs, incorporating indigenous architecture and artifacts into his canvases. The Santa Fe Museum of Art owns one of Cheney's paintings, and a strong portrait of Cheney's from his time in Santa Fe is of Paul Hohen, who ran an auto repair shop where Cheney got his Ford serviced. The juxtaposition of U.S. Senator Bronson Cutting and Paul Hohen signals an important facet to Cheney's personality: his affability and willingness to befriend many different people from all walks of life. At one point, Hohen's wife became ill and was hospitalized. Cheney minded Hohen's auto repair shop for him so that he could go visit his wife. And later, Cheney asked Hohen to sit to have his portrait painted. Cheney was enthusiastic about his Paul Hohen painting, and he wrote in a letter to Matthiessen the following: "I am certain that this picture of Paul Hohen is my most direct achievement. My complete indifference to its technical quality is what I'll stand by or fall by. It's as natural as breathing. And here's the crossroads. Should you trust yourself and just be yourself as this picture is, or should you consider your job a craftsman's job and be miserable because there are spots in the background and dull drawing in the fingers? No consideration, no careful preparation, and damn, it lives and breathes." Showing this group of things to Knapp, a relative. "Yesterday did it, removed me to suddenly see what it all meant, a direct expression of myself. The painting was no longer something to try, but crossed the borderline into being me." Mathiessen's response to Cheney's letter about Paul Hohen captures the intellectual, creative, and sexual energy in their relationship. Matthiessen wrote, "Your extraordinary, poignant letter about your painting and your new feeling toward it have been throbbing through me all day. How you can invigorate me, feller, when you write like that. It's as though you poured new hot blood into my veins." Matthiessen and Cheney returned to the Southwest from the fall of 1934 to the spring of 1935. Matthiessen was on sabbatical from Harvard, where he spent the bulk of his professional life. Matthiessen had been politically engaged since he was a student, but during his time in New Mexico, he got involved in one of the most important events of his political activism of the 1930s. Gallup, New Mexico is about 3 hours west of Santa Fe. It's about 20 minutes from the Arizona border. During the 1930s, Gallup was a coal mining town that had fallen on hard times during the Depression. The Gallup American Coal Company sold the land under its shanty town that housed migrant Mexican workers to a state senator with purported ties to the underworld. A Mexican miner by the name state senator quickly raised rents on unemployed migrant workers. And a Mexican miner by the name of Navarro was arrested for non-payment of rent. At the hearing, a riot broke out, and Sheriff Mac R. Carmichael was killed. Under New Mexican law at the time, if a law officer were killed in a riot, everyone in the mob could be held responsible. Gallup police arrested over 100 people, many of whom did not speak English. Matthiessen joined a crew of reporters and lawyers investigating the riot. He wrote an article about it for the New Republic magazine. Despite Mathiessen's privileged upbringing, he was interested in progressive political causes, especially related to socioeconomic equality. As he wrote in his article, State Senator Vogel's actions made him the focus of the workers' dread and hatred of exploitation. Toward Sheriff Carmichael, they seem to have held no resentment. He had the reputation of being a good officer. They had simply been goaded beyond endurance and could not suffer the sight of another of their fellows being led to jail. But there is a danger here that too much blame will be attached to the senator. He makes too convenient a smokescreen behind which the mine operators can hide their own social irresponsibility. Too easy a scapegoat for abuses that are products of not any individual or group of individuals, but of a whole diseased condition of society. While in Santa Fe, Matthiessen had been at work on the book for which he would become best known, American Renaissance Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson, Emerson and Whitman, which was published in May of 1941. The question at the center of the book is fairly straightforward. In the years 1850 to 1855, a number of classic texts by American authors were published, including The Scarlet Letter, 1850, The House of Seven Gables, 1851, Moby Dick, 1851, Walden, 1854, and Leaves of Grass, 1855. Matthiessen asked, why? What did this moment of cultural expression represent? How did it come about? And why did it happen when it did? In subsequent decades, the book has been criticized as too narrowly conceived, but the book did help establish the field of American studies. And that, in turn, helped establish Matthiessen as one of the preeminent scholars of his generation and paved the way to his appointment as a full professor at Harvard in 1942. On reading the manuscript, Cheney said that he was strongly struck by the fine intricacy of pattern and thought in the book. Interestingly, Mathiessen's connection to Santa Fe figures into the book as well, in that it's dedicated to one of the people it's dedicated to was Harry Dorman, who lived in Santa Fe. Dorman had arrived in Santa Fe in 1901, suffering with tuberculosis. Cheney and Matthiessen met him in 1929 or 1930. Like Matthiessen, Dorman was politically active and progressive. Like Cheney, architecture interested Dorman. And he helped promote traditional architecture of the Southwest, including Spanish Pueblo revival and California mission. and sought out styles that were independent of a European past. In 1913, Dorman became president of the Chamber of Commerce of Santa Fe, promoting the city to tuberculosis specialists who in turn recommended the city to their patients. On the surface, Matthiessen and Cheney would in many ways seem to live a charmed life. They had a beautiful house in Maine. They spent extended periods of time in Santa Fe. There were Cheney's paintings and Mathiessen's books and writings. But both men had more than their fair share of health problems. Matthiessen entered McLean Hospital the day after Christmas 1938, nominally over the stress of trying to complete American Renaissance. It was at McLean that Matthiessen recorded his first suicidal impulses. He wrote, "I was hauled out of sleep by the fantasy that it would be better if I jumped out a window." And during the succeeding week in Kittery, Maine, where he and Cheney had a house, I was recurrently filled with the desire to kill myself. Associated with Harvard Medical School, McLean has had many famous patients over the years, including poets Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and Robert Lowell, and singer James Taylor. McLean was situated originally on 250 acres in Belmont, Massachusetts, about a half an hour west of Boston, and fears of Cheney's death dominated Mathiessen's thoughts at McLean. But as usual, Matthiessen and Cheney were more intimate in their letters. Matthiessen wrote to Cheney, "Well, the letters warmed me right through, just as they used to do when I was at Oxford or you were at Santa Fe, or whenever we were long apart. It is one of the real beauties that never once has the freshness of your life lost any trace of magic for me. Every day is a new discovery of your wealth." Beginning in the fall of 1940, Cheney was in and out of Baldpate Hospital for roughly 3 years. Located in Georgetown, Massachusetts, about 40 minutes north of Boston, Baldpate opened in 1939 and specialized in treatment for alcohol and drug addictions, personality disorders, neuroses, and psychoses. Cheney was probably admitted to Baldpate for his drinking, which had become problematic in the last years of his life. Baldpate's setting and amenities resembled those of McLean, but there was one important distinction at Baldpate. Doctors at Baldpate relied on neurological means to cure mental illnesses, in addition to psychiatric treatments such as talk therapy or occupational therapy. As a consequence, doctors at Baldpate relied on shock therapies, including insulin shock therapy, in which a coma is induced in a patient with large doses of insulin, and metrazole and electroshock therapies, in which seizures are induced in patients. Doctors at Baldpate also performed lobotomies. I've uncovered circumstantial but compelling evidence that in May 1942, Cheney underwent metrazole shock therapy to try and help him with his drinking problem. As Cheney wrote to Matthiessen on May 4th, 1942, quote, "I want to take the drastic step that he, Dr. Fleming, Cheney's doctor, suggests. I don't care how hard it is, I'm going to do it." A course of metrazole shock therapy consisted of approximately 7 injections of the drug over 4 weeks. Metrazole induced seizures in patients, the idea being somewhat akin to rebooting your computer. The doctors were trying to reboot the nervous systems of patients. Seizures typically started 15 seconds after an injection and lasted for up to a minute. Patients were gagged and bound during the procedure so as not to injure themselves. Perhaps not surprisingly, metrazole shock treatment was not successful in helping Cheney curtail his drinking. In 1943, though, Cheney did hit on a better method of controlling his drinking. During the winter months, he went to live with his sister, Theodora, and her husband in Texas. The warm climate did not aggravate his breathing problems, so he was less inclined to drink excessively to try and calm himself in response. And in the spring of 1944, while visiting his sister and her husband, he made his last trip to Santa Fe. Still, Cheney missed life in New England and life with Matthiessen. And his correspondence from the spring of 1945, is both tender and heartbreaking. And this reading is from the chapter toward the end of the book entitled The Green Light Across the Piscataqua. Cheney, too, eagerly anticipated a good steady time all summer. He was not drinking in April and May and feeling confident and thrilled to be coming home to Kittery. As if to get himself in the mood for his return to coastal Maine, he was rereading Deep Haven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Quote, "When the moon is full again, I'll be seeing it across the Piscataqua waters with a green light and the good smell of salts," Cheney wrote on May 6th. In a literal sense, he referred to the green beacon of the lighthouse at Fort Constitution, which signals the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor across the Piscataqua River and is visible from the house that he shared with Matthiessen. But the highly literate Cheney was almost certainly alluding to the green light that Jay Gatsby watches longingly at the end of Daisy Buchanan's Pier, a light that came to symbolize Gatsby's hope that his love for Daisy would make up for all the sordidness of his past as a bootlegger. Beyond that, the image of the green light is so fertile because it taps into the strong current of American thought that everything can be made right, that the brightness of the future will make up for all the difficulties of the past. Cheney died on July 12, 1945 of thrombosis, a blood clot in the circulatory system, which can often lead to a heart attack. His body was returned to South Manchester, and he was buried from the same house in which he had been born. After Cheney's death, Matthiessen worked diligently to secure the painter's legacy. Notably, in 1946-1947, he published a monograph of Cheney's work entitled Russell Cheney, A Record of His Work, which remains the most comprehensive single volume devoted to the painter's work until this day. In the days, weeks, months, and years that followed Cheney's death, Matthiessen, as if seeking camaraderie in a different sphere, threw himself into political activism. Since his earliest days at Yale, Matthiessen had been interested in progressive political causes, often in association with organized labor. But after Cheney's death, Mathiessen's political activism was nonstop. And on this slide and the following slide are a list of events that Matthiessen participated in or organizations he was affiliated with. And this is in addition to his teaching duties at Harvard, spending half a year teaching in Eastern Europe in 1947, writing and publishing a memoir about writing books on Henry James, the James family, Russell Cheney, and Theodore Dreiser, and editing collections of Henry James's stories and notebooks, as well as the Oxford Book of American Verse. Mathiessen's grief over Cheney's death presumably contributed to his nonstop work and political activism. And the social aspect of grief for a same-sex couple cannot be ignored here. Matthiessen couldn't let on to the broader world how deeply he was grieving. To the world, he had simply lost his good friend and housemate. This forced dissimulation, having to hide the depth of his grief on some level, must have played a part in his deepening depression in the years after Cheney died. And this last reading is from the chapter entitled Losing Touch, Life Without Cheney. But if happiness beckoned across the Atlantic, subterranean thoughts and emotions simultaneously compelled Matthiessen toward a darker course. Matthiessen had returned to Boston from Maine, and on Friday, March 31st, he left his Pinckney Street apartment and checked in at the Manger Hotel on Causeway Street, adjacent to North Station. Matthiessen needed height for what he planned to do. He was shown to room 1219 facing southwest. Matthiessen had dinner plans at the home of Kenneth and Eleanor Murdoch back on Beacon Hill, so he didn't settle into his hotel room for the night. To Murdoch, Matthiessen seemed tired and depressed at dinner. Matthiessen presumably didn't say anything to his friends about having checked in to the Manger Hotel earlier that day. On parting after dinner at about 30 minutes before midnight, Matthiessen told the Murdochs to remember that he loved them. It was a cloudy night, but comparatively mild for early spring, with temperatures in the high 40s. On getting back to his hotel room, Matthiessen continued to prepare his room. On the desk, he placed his skull and bone pin and a letter in which he asked that his friends Kenneth Murdoch, Helen Bain Knapp, and Ruth Putnam, as well as his sister, Lucy Newbrand, be contacted, but not until morning. In the letter, Matthiessen also asked that they go to his apartment and see that several other letters on his desk were mailed. In one of those letters, Matthiessen told Paul Sweezy that he feared there was, quote, nothing but desolate solitude ahead. He told Lewis Hyde that he could no longer bear the loneliness with which I'm faced. To his friends, generally, Matthiessen wrote, I am exhausted. I've been subject to so many severe depressions the past few years that I can no longer believe that I can continue to be of use to my profession and my friends. I hope my friends will be able to believe that I still love them in spite of this desperate act. Perhaps another half hour passed. Matthiessen took off his glasses. Perhaps time enough to think about the cottage in Kittery, the most beautiful house in America, or to recall the cat's baby and pretzel. Time enough to think about riding his bicycle through the English countryside during his Oxford days, shouting out with joy, rat, rat, my Godfellow, how I love you. Or the day he stood on the beach in Maine, clad only in seaweed, his arms outstretched toward the ocean and sky. Or the incident of the pair, the night aboard the Paris after he and Cheney had met. At about midnight outside the Manger on Nashua Street, a taxi driver named Jesse Reeves was startled by a tremendous noise. A man had just fallen or jumped from a 12th floor window. Matthiessen was still breathing when the ambulance crew arrived, but he died before they could reach City Hospital 2.5 miles away. Matthiessen planned to leave the bulk of his estate to friends, his family of choice, and to Yale. In his will, Matthiessen made clear that out of all his worldly possessions, the house in Kittery, Maine, a townhouse on Beacon Hill, his papers, even the letters, he valued Cheney's paintings the most. The opening sentence of his will conveys as much. Now that I have some property that is important to dispose of carefully, I refer to Russell Cheney's paintings. I am drafting this will to cancel the one that I made several years ago. He also bequeathed private correspondence between him and Cheney to Lewis Hyde, his Skull and Bones brother. The letters are peppered with tenderness and love and were therefore the kind of incriminating evidence that one would have instructed a legatee to burn rather than preserve. By entrusting them to Hyde, Matthiessen seemed to acknowledge their great importance. Matthiessen wanted what was contained in those letters, the expression of love, to live on, despite the fact that he probably couldn't envision how that might happen. The end. Thank you very much.